So the interesting part about cybersecurity is you can have the latest, most up-to-date firewalls, endpoint security, antivirus, whatever you want to call it, right? But the biggest point of failure is generally the user. I have two articles for you guys today, and both malwares essentially still use users clicking stuff as the way to get a foothold into a computer. And that's what I find just crazy, that in the modern day, we're still ultimately limited by the user. Let's talk about it. Today, we're facing an unprecedented array of data breaches, hacking attempts, and surges in digital crime. Why is there such a widespread amount, and how little is noticed in our everyday lives? Malware, dark sites, brute forcing, zero-day script kiddies, and nation-state hackers are all on the rise. Learn more about the threats we face and gain a bit more knowledge than yesterday. Hey everyone, another episode of Exploit Brokers is coming to you now. Hey guys, if you could do me a huge favor to help grow the channel, if you could hit the like, subscribe, and bell notification icon if you're on YouTube, and if you're listening to us on a podcast platform like Spotify or Apple Podcast, if you could please give us a follow or subscribe and give us a good rating if you don't mind, I'd appreciate it greatly and you'd help the channel grow. So guys, welcome to another episode. I have two articles by Dark Reading. We can jump into the first one. Revamped Remcos rat deployed against Microsoft Windows users. Windows users are at risk for full device takeover by an emerging malicious version of the Remcos remote admin tool, which is being used in an ongoing campaign exploiting a known remote code execution (RCE) vulnerability in Microsoft Office and WordPad. So, before we jump into it, I kind of want to break down that subheader. So whenever you talk about a full device takeover, that's essentially any time where an attacker or a hacker can gain full control of the computer, right? So think a admin having access to control or do anything on a computer, right? So think updating or accessing files or changing settings or etc. When you do a full device takeover, it's just that you're taking over the device. Now, the Remcos is a remote admin tool, which there is a lot of legitimate reasons to be able to control a remote computer, such as helping users troubleshoot stuff, updating things, computer management for larger organizations, right? If you have a team of techs and you have, say, 10,000 computers, it's kind of not feasible for them to go to each physical one in a timely and quick manner. Where if you have remote admin tools, they can remote in, start running updates, jump to the next one, jump to the next one, jump to the next one, all while being at their desk and able to multitask or do other things as well. It just makes it easier. And as well, I've even used remote admin tools to help people like my father and things like that update their computers, because if I'm in a far enough distance away from them, it's just more practical. Now, the RCE, a remote code execution vulnerability, is any time that you can run a piece of code or a piece of software almost on a remote machine unintentionally. Whether that's because of something where they're just taking in the command and executing it, or there's a way to control and take over the flow of execution of commands. All that to say, you're able to run a piece of code on a remote computer or server and able to execute commands, which kind of mean you're able to do a lot of things you shouldn't. So with that taken out of the way, let's jump into the main article. Threat actors have given the commercially available Remcos remote access tool a new malicious makeover, wrapping its malware code in several layers of varying script languages, including JavaScript, VB Script, and PowerShell, to avoid detection and analysis and achieve full takeover of Microsoft Windows devices. New findings from Fortinet researcher Xiaopeng Zhang warned Microsoft Windows users about a new campaign using this new and improved version of Remcos rat that exploits a known remote code execution (RCE) vulnerability arising from how unpatched Microsoft Office and WordPad instances parse files. Here is where there's two parts. When I say the human component of security, there's ultimately several aspects that go into that, but here there's two things, right? One is organizations and users not having a proper update path or update policy. The problem here is not that this is some kind of remote code execution 0 day, This is a known, and I'll get to that in the next paragraph, but this is a known vulnerability that is available in Microsoft Office and WordPad. But because they weren't patched, there's still a lot of vulnerable versions out there, and that's where this kind of takes a foothold. If you had an updated Microsoft Office and WordPad past the point where this was patched, then this malware wouldn't affect those users. But in this case, there is unpatched versions. Let's continue on with the article. The attack chain starts with a phishing email intended to lure users into clicking an Excel file disguised as a business order, according to the report. Once the file is activated, it exploits the bug CVE 2017-0199 and downloads the malware payload. So the CVE 2017 essentially means this is a vulnerability that was discovered back in 2017. Thus my previous comment, where if there was a proper policy, or if for the case that this is not organizations but individuals, if there's a proper habit of running updates and things in a timely manner, then this malware wouldn't affect as many users as it does or as it could, because they're still running old and outdated versions. Now granted, there might be some legitimate reasons, whether it's backwards compatibility or something else, to run an older version of a software. It should be the exception, not the norm, versus it seems to be a pretty common thing where older and unpatched bugs still exist because they were never updated to include the version of the software that actually has the patch for it. I believe this is known as one-day vulnerabilities, but I could be misremembering that. Moving on, Remcos' new version is good at avoiding analysis. Its code is wrapped in multiple layers using different script languages and encoding methods, including JavaScript, VB-script, base64 encoded, URL encoded, and PowerShell, to protect itself from detection and analysis, according to the researcher. Once the downloaded exe file, dllhost.exe, starts, it extracts a batch of files into the %appdata% folder. Some of the key data are hidden in these files. So let's kind of break a little bit of that technical down, because if you aren't used to diving into some of this stuff, then this is kind of different. And for some of my more technical users, this is still kind of an interesting thing to go into. So JavaScript, VB-script are two separate scripting languages. JavaScript is pretty heavily known for web-based development, think websites and things like that. VB-script is Visual Basic Script, and that's a bit of an older language that was based, pretty much it's the Visual Basic stuff that was very popular, I think, back in the 90s. And it's still used because I think a lot of the Office products can run VB scripts. So that's kind of where it comes from. I don't have a lot of experience with VB script, but I've heard its name around both from malware and from a programming perspective. Now, base64 encoded is whenever you get a string and you encode it into a 64 base kind of language. So think, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. There's ways to do that on base 64. URL encoded means that you're getting a string that's friendly to the URL in your browser. And PowerShell is if you've ever heard of command prompt, PowerShell is kind of like the newer, older, more powerful brother of command prompt. At least it can be more powerful, but it's definitely newer. So it's using all these things together to avoid detection and analysis. Now, an exe file is an executable. Think anything that you double click and can run. A DLL, and here it's called dllhost.exe, but a DLL, which is what it's trying to kind of obfuscate itself as via naming, a DLL is a supporting file that an exe essentially uses to load in libraries and other things. It's called a dynamic linked library, I believe. It's been a while since I've coded in C and C++, but I believe it does stand for dynamically linked library. I won't go into any further details beyond that, but I'll probably release an episode later talking about it. Now, the app data folder is a folder that's hidden away from most users, but is where a lot of programs put data that's relevant to the program itself running. Think of it kind of like a catch-all for any kind of data that a program might need during its runtime, startup, and stuff like that. Anything that isn't part of its persistent package when it writes or installs itself to disk. From there, the host, and I'm continuing the article, from there, the host runs a piece of heavily obfuscated PowerShell code that importantly works only on 32-bit PowerShell process, the report added. Next, the malware runs self-decryption code hidden beneath a rat nest, pun intended, of unnecessary code to avoid analysis. But that isn't the only sophisticated evasion technique utilized by the latest version of malicious Remcos rat. According to the report, the campaign throws up several analysis roadblocks through the attack chain, including installing a vectored exception handler and gaining and calling system APIs in an inconsistent, hard-to-track way. It also uses a tool called ZW Set Information Thread to check for a debugger, the report added. So here there's some more technical information to break down, right? So when we start talking about system APIs are anything that's essentially a system call that allows programs to ask the underlying operating system to do something, like access a piece of protected memory or to access devices and things like that on a computer. Because by themselves, programs can do a lot, but they can't do everything. They need to be able to talk to existing functionality in the operating system, and that's done through system calls. There's a concept of user land and kernel land being a much more privileged version of things that can run, because it's stuff that's set for the kernel, or the core part of an operating system. And then you have userland, which is where programs and user stuff generally run. Userland is not as privileged or as capable as kernel land, but they both talk to each other to be able to offload certain things from one space to another. Now, the fact that they're doing this in an inconsistent and hard to track way is pretty interesting. Whenever you do system calls on any kind of software, you can do what's essentially the idea of fingerprinting, right? If you know that system call A is called, and then right after system call B is called twice, system call D is called 3 times, and then system call A is called once more, and that happens every time this program is executed, then you can easily write that into a set of rules to determine if this piece of software or malware is running on a system. Because if that order of system calls is called by a single process, well, that's a way to essentially fingerprint this process or this code. Continuing, the malicious code calls API ZW Set Information Thread with the argument thread hide from debugger 0x11 and the current thread 0x and then several F's and an E. I'm not going to count how many. This mechanism in Windows can conceal a thread's existence from debuggers, explained Zhang. If a debugger is attached to the current process, it exits immediately once the API is called. So, a little bit more information. A debugger is let's call it a piece of software, but it's essentially a piece of software that allows developers, or in this case, malware analysts, to debug a piece of code. It attaches itself to the running code, so that way you can essentially debug it. You're looking through it and trying to stop its execution to look at things like registry values or variable values, or to pretty much examine the code. The alternative to this is stuff like putting a lot of print statements, and if any of you have ever been a beginner programmer, print statements tend to be the favorite of a lot of beginner programmers until they can figure out what debuggers are, and debuggers becomes a very powerful workflow for any software engineer or programmer or scripter to be able to run through their code and understand what's happening at any given time. Now, if we continue with the article, the malware further uses an API hooking technique to avoid detection. The malicious code simulates executing multiple API instructions, say 2 instructions, at the beginning, and then jumps to the API to execute the rest of the instructions, beginning with the 3rd instruction. According to the report, whenever any detection conditions are triggered, the current process, PowerShell.exe, can become unresponsive, crash, or exit unexpectedly. So, when you do API hooking, if memory serves correct, you're essentially hooking, right? You're tapping into API calls, so that way you can do stuff when they are called as well. So if you've ever heard of like vampire taps for networking or Wireshark or anything like that, right? You're hooking into the network to try to sniff traffic. In this case, you're modifying the flow of that system call to be able to do things whenever it's called, whether that's preventing it from being called, simulating, doing some logging, or doing something else, and then calling the actual thing. That really is up to how you implement the API hooking or what you want to do. Once ready, the threat actors download an encrypted file with a malicious version of Remcos rat that is run in current process's memory, effectively making this latest variant fileless, the report pointed out. This is another, so far just reading through this piece of malware is not only extremely well built from a discovery standpoint, right? From a malware analyst standpoint, they are putting in a lot of different obstacles to have malware and reverse engineers unable to really get at it. Whenever a piece of malware is fileless, whenever it executes in memory, that becomes very tricky. Whenever you have reverse engineers or malware analysts or developers trying to get a piece of a sample, you generally get it from the file system. Whenever you write something to file or to a file system, it becomes essentially a copy of it on disk. There is tools like DD in Linux and some Windows tools that let you image a file system so that way you can do analysis and some other cool stuff on it. I remembered back in college, I took a class with cyber and I was able to use the DD command to kind of cut up parts of a file system to try to find hidden images and files and things like that. But you would mount a file system, and that's where, if you're writing a malware to file, that's kind of where it becomes easy to pull out. If it's only in memory, then there is no trace for you to pull out from the file system. It was never saved anywhere. It was just executed into memory. And that makes it harder to retrieve. At that point, you're going to have something like network traffic to try to recreate the file download and then try to see if you can do some fancy stuff on that. But it's just substantially easier to pull a file that's in the file system than something that was only executed in memory. So going forward, Remcos collects some basic information from the victim's device, Zhang added. It then encrypts and sends the collected data to its C2 server, the command and control server, to register that victim's device is online and ready to be controlled. Anti-analysis and tricky obfuscation techniques aside, Darren Guccione, CEO and founder of Cybersecurity, noted in an email statement that the low-tech phishing and social engineering that remain among the very most dangerous enterprise cybersecurity threats. So here's where I'm going to stop the article and just kind of go to talk about what it's essentially saying. You can have the most sophisticated endpoint detection. You can have the most sophisticated antivirus. You can have the most sophisticated, SOC, the Security Operations Center. But it doesn't matter if your users keep clicking stuff. Because ultimately, you can have a bunch of malware, super sophisticated, but if you can't get it on a system machine and executing, it doesn't do anything. You could burn a 0-day, sure, but that's pretty expensive, and there's a lot of, even if you're not wasting money, the technical knowledge needed to get 0 days that can do some really cool stuff is very difficult. It's not only an opportunity game where there has to be something somewhere that can be executed like an RCE or something, but it also takes very technically skilled manpower for bug researchers or vulnerability researchers or bug bounty hunters to find really, really good vulnerabilities that could escalate to more things. And at that point, getting a user to click something doesn't take anywhere as much technical capability as, an RCE vulnerability or remote code execution vulnerability that can take over system. And, in this case, if they were to patch stuff, that RCE wouldn't even matter. But there's ultimately the user and the user clicking and running stuff, whether that's in an enterprise environment or at home. Users clicking stuff is how most malware gets on the system. It's not a fast and hard rule. It's just what has been kind of looked at a lot, and training is the best way, right? The more we know, the better. Security by obscurity does not work, right? And that's the end of the first article. Let's go ahead and jump into the second one. So, another article by Dark Reading. Flexible structure of zip archives exploited to hide malware undetected. Attackers abuse concatenation, a method that involves appending multiple zip archives into a single file to deliver a variant of the smoke loader Trojan hidden in malicious attachments delivered via phishing. Back to the user, right? Phishing is sending out a bunch of emails and hoping the user clicks. You're pretending, the hacker or attacker's pretending to do something, be someone, or need something, and the end user falls for it. Threat actors are exploiting the various ways that zip files combine multiple archives into one file as an anti-detection tactic in phishing attacks that deliver various Trojan malware strains, including Smoke Loader. Smoke Loader, as far as I'm aware, is a piece of malware that's essentially known as a loader. It's something that loads in or brings in something else. So it by itself is, yes, it is a virus, it's a Trojan, but it doesn't do anything like stealing your information, all that. It brings in other pieces of software that do things that you don't want to do. So this is essentially a loader, a downloader, an installer, if you will. Attackers are abusing the structural flexibility of zip files through a technique known as concatenation, a method that involves appending multiple zip archives into a single file. New research from Perception Point has found in this method the combined files appear as one archive that actually contains multiple central directories, each pointing to different set of file entries. So, whenever you're talking about zip files or archive files, whether that's 7-zip, RAR, .zip, etc., they're a file, right? They're a file that compresses down information, but how you build it depends on multiple things. Here, in the concatenation mechanism, you're getting multiple files and putting them all into a single zip. If you've ever had to send, multiple PDFs and you zip that up, that's kind of what this is talking. However, this discrepancy in handling concatenated zips allows attackers to evade detection tools by hiding malicious payloads in parts of the archive that some zip readers cannot or do not access. Abusing concatenation allows attackers to hide malware in zip files that even readers aimed at parsing the files for an in-depth analysis, including 7-zip or OS native tools, may not detect, according to Perception Point. Threat actors know these tools will often miss or overlook the malicious content hidden within concatenated archives, allowing them to deliver their payload undetected and target users who use a specific program to work with archives. So here, it's kind of like know your customer. It's know your victim, essentially. Threat actors know user behaviors when it comes to zip files. Most people trust and just open zip files, but that could be wrong for a multitude of reasons, from stuff from malicious or malformed zips to stuff like this. In general, the advice I'll give to anybody is, if it's not something from someone you trust or something you're expecting or something that's making you want to do something urgently, proceed with caution. Avoid opening if you can. Reach out to your IT. Figure out who sent this and what it is before you actually start opening, clicking, or doing anything, because last thing you want is to get pumped. To illustrate how zip files can be misused, the post breaks down the different ways 3 popular zip archive readers, 7-zip, Windows File Explorer, and WinRAR, handle concatenated zip files. 7-zip, for example, will only display the contents of the first archive and then may display a warning that there are some data after the end of the archive. However, this message is overlooked and thus malicious files may not be detected. And that's kind of the problem. And you see that with a lot of software, right? If there's a specific way to implement it, every vendor might have a different way of implementing it, which means you have multiple things that can go wrong, and each vendor has a piece of the thing that can go wrong. Continuing, Windows File Explorer demonstrates different potential for malicious use, as it may fail to open the file altogether, or if renamed to RAR, will display only the malicious second archive's contents, according to the post. In both cases, its handling of such files leaves gaps if used in a security context. Weisbull and Cabra wrote, WinRAR takes a different tack in that it actually reads the second central directory and displays the contents of the second and potentially malicious archive, making it a unique tool in revealing hidden payload, they added. Ultimately, though sometimes the readers detect the malicious activity, the different ways that each reader handle concatenated files leaves room for exploit, leading to varying outcomes and potential security implications, according to Perception Point. So, this is something that all pieces of software that implement something go with, right? Whether that's different web servers, whether that's different parsing mechanisms or pieces of code, whenever you have a standard or an idea or a concept, there's a million ways to implement, right? The cool part about code is there really is a million ways to do one single thing, as simple as it may be. Think sorting a list. There's multiple different sorts that are found in computer science, different algorithms, right? Bubble sort, merge sort, etc. And that's just for sorting a list of things, right? When you talk about compression, well, there's a lot of math and different things that are involved in zips and compression and archive files. Not to mention there's even stuff that's built into Linux like tar files, etc. But it's just really cool because you're seeing the little nuances are introducing problems where the nuances were made to accommodate different things. But that's kind of what you see with a lot of software in general. The more corner cases that a software tries to fill, the more chances something goes wrong. Whether it's a bug that's inconsequential and just crashes something, whether it's a legit kind of remote code execution vulnerability stemming from it, it's all bugs at the end of the day. So the phishing attack that exploits concatenation observed by perception point starts with an email that purports to come from a shipping company and uses urgency to bait users. Again, if something's saying you need to do something in the next 5 minutes, whoa, slow down, proceed with caution. The email is marked with high importance and includes an attachment, shipping_inv_pl_bl_pdf.rar, sent under the guise that it's a shipping document that must be reviewed before shipment can be completed. And here's where the psychology of humans come in, right? Urgency makes us want to act without fully understanding or thinking. Sales tactics use it, malware and hackers use it. It's all trying to get someone to do something. The attached file appears to be a RAR archive due to its RAR extension, but it's actually a concatenated zip file, deliberately disguised to confuse the user not only by exploiting trust associated with RAR files, but also bypassing basic detections that might rely on file extensions for initial file assessments, according to the post. This is one thing I don't like. This is where my complaints as a software engineer come in. You should never trust file extension because it's actually really easy to change file extensions. On Windows, you can change it and it'll complain, are you sure you want to change it? On Linux, you can just change it. And I believe Mac also just lets you change it. The file extension essentially is a convenient way of saying what the data is, but you can lie, right? You can lie about what the data is with that extension. And the reason you want to, whether it's malicious, corrupted, or otherwise, right? I've seen unethical life hacks on TikTok, I believe, where it's like, or YouTube as well, YouTube Shorts, where it's like, hey, grab some random file, change it to the extension of your homework, submit it, and oh, well, I submitted it, but it's corrupted. Let me go ahead and send that later today once I get home. When in reality, you never did the homework and you've been using the entire time to finish the homework. That's one use case of changing a extension. But extensions only tell you what the file structure should be. They don't enforce anything. And whenever a system trusts the file extension, that's where a lot of problems can also come up. So if we keep going, the file contains a variant of the known Trojan malware family smoke loader that's designed to automate malicious tasks such as downloading and executing additional payloads, which could include other types of malware such as banking, Trojans, or ransomware. However, when tested, only 2 of the 3 tools that parse zip files actually detected that there is potentially malicious archive in the file. According to the post, opening the attachment using 7-zip reveals only a benign looking PDF titled x.pdf, which appears to be an innocent shipping document. On the other hand, both Windows File Explorer and WinRAR fully expose a hidden danger. Both tools display the contents of the second archive, including the malicious executable shipping_inv_pl_bl_pdf.exe, which is designed to run and execute the malware Valsbull and Cabra wrote. So an exe is something that's meant to run. It's a binary, it's an executable, it's going to run. And the fact that there's some archive tools that ignore the extra stuff it's concerning, because archives are what makes the internet go round, right? Whenever you talk about compression, it's what allows us to minimize traffic, whether there's something known as gzip for like website technology that allows you to send down packets compressed, which reduce bandwidth, or for just basic file management, right? If you can compress a 10 gig file down to 2, it's just easier to store that. So, it would be nice if we can get more of the archive software developers on board. So here's where I guess I'm a little bit irritated. Perception Point security researchers contacted developers of 7-Zip to address the behavior they observed between its readers and of concatenated zip files, according to the post. However, the response did not acknowledge that it is any kind of vulnerability. The developer confirmed that it is not a bug and it is considered intentional functionality, meaning this behavior is unlikely to change, leaving the door open for attackers to continue exploiting. And that is either there is a miscommunication or misconnection between where they want the product to go and then this bug, or they just don't care, or they don't have the manpower to fix it. Whatever the opportunity may be, the fact that they're seeing this as intentional functionality doesn't sit well with me. If you're saying that being able to look at all the files in an archive is not intended functionality, it's an archiving tool. It's something that is meant to be able to read, compress, uncompress, and work with and manipulate archive files. So the fact it can't read other stuff in it is just kind of weird, especially when you have like the built-in Microsoft one doing it. I really think this is the developers of 7-Zip dropping the ball. This is my opinion, but I think they're dropping the ball here because they should just fix it. They should patch it, make it work, and it makes the user safer. It makes their product more usable and in a way better. And I just find it a bit frustrating. They could do it, at least I think they could do it, unless there's some really bad code there, which I hope not for their sake. But I just don't understand why not. And it is a vulnerability in my opinion, but that's just me. All that to say, you guys be careful out there with zip files, archive files, and remember, sometimes the most critical part of cybersecurity infrastructure is the user, is the person clicking stuff. Try not to click random things. Try to be on the lookout for this kind of stuff. I want to thank you for tuning in to another episode of Exploit Brokers, and I'll catch you in the next one.